been squatting in a condemned high-rise. These are the rules I follow to stay safe. I am not homeless. I have a home. I simply don't own it, but it's mine and I'm working to keep it. Every city has its share of abandoned buildings to squat in, but you typically have to deal with cops or creepy neighbors. The Andale high-rise possesses neither. Both the police and the villagers keep away. As a foreigner from out of town, I came across the location on my first night in the city and found it odd that a 28-story tower block had been left to rot. Every window is black. Every light in the courtyard was smashed. There are no automobiles in the lot. There is no guard's booth. The fence did not even have barbed wire on it. Despite being only half a mile from a playground full of shouting drunken youngsters, none of them wandered towards Andale. There are no fires, music, or bottles shooting through the air. It was silent. Inside, I discovered that the foyer had been broken up. Double doors were wrenched open and left like way for what seemed like years. Curious visitors had easy access, but I was the only one there. The majority of the first story had collapsed. Poor British weather transformed waterlogged ceiling tiles into mulch. I understand that water is invasive, but it had nearly invaded the place to the point where algae was growing on the walls. Even the elevator shaft became inundated. My own mirror stared back at me as I peered through the brackish water, catching a sight of the old rusting wagon a few feet below. I couldn't help but imagine myself on top of it, waist high and reaching down to release the emergency hatch. It's only logical to wonder what was beneath there. Little Metal Box has been soaking in pitch-black water for years. Against all reasoning, I considered hitting the button, summoning the elevator, and watching it climb. I still remember this sight from time to time. Meanwhile, the empty shaft loomed above, with cables whistling in the breeze. I've learned not to linger on it. If you peek up, you could notice something ducking out of the way, pulling its head through the doors before you can get a good look. It finds it extremely amusing and even attempts to construct a game out of it, such as peekaboo. However, if you play for too long, it will appear elsewhere. An open door becomes an invitation. More than a few people were sent rushing for their lives in the middle of the night, but the news was dreadful for them. If it's part of a game, that creature has every right to depart this place. When you ask about Andale, most people simply shrug or laugh. Kids will talk about it in the same way they would about any haunted house. The difference is that no one dared anyone to go up there. Nobody uses it to get furious or high. Nobody sneaks into the basement to have a risky little fuck. Nobody hides their stashes there. It has all the elements of a classic urban legend, except that people avoid it. They'll laugh, joke, and tell terrifying stories, but they treat the soil as if it contained a nuclear leak. And I'm surprised the council hasn't rejected it because they, more than anyone else in the city, stand to lose the most by discussing it. It was built in the mid-1950s as government housing. Only a few of the young mothers who moved in there noticed their children's health deteriorating. Started with babies. Babies who would not wake up after a restful night's sleep. The kind of fatalities that were passed off as neglect or abuse. Screaming adolescent girls carted off to prison based on the statements of doctors who didn't care. Some people blame the mother for everything, and these girls had no one to defend them. 2 the first year, 4 the following year, and so on until it closed. It wasn't until 1982 that someone linked the deaths to contaminated water storage on the top. Toxic metals are leaching into the supply. Not enough to kill an adult, but grave news for anyone with a compromised immune system. 38 women were imprisoned by then. Another 23 had committed suicide before they could be condemned. And those are the only ones that have been accounted for. Not all of the deaths occurred in the water. Andale has a way of being harmful to any child's health, regardless of the circumstances. More than a few babies starved to death while their parents rotted in the bathtub from an overdose. Even more were lost when they discovered their parents' stockpile, young bodies writhing in agony as their frantic mothers cried for aid. One person tripped into the elevator shaft because the doors opened as if the carriage were standing there, and they are the ones that were discovered. Many more people went missing and their disappearances were attributed to running away. In the end, Andale's reputation as a cursed location became so awful that the only way out was to shut it down completely, board it up, delete it from the records, pretend it never happened, and simply forget. But Andale continued to kill even after the doors were formally closed. If anything, it simply grew worse. I spoke with one detective who informed me that he discovered a man dead from sepsis on the 6th floor, a few years after the facility was closed. Nobody could believe it. They believe this guy scratched himself on a nail and developed gangrene like it was the 1800s. Never visited the hospital, just lay there and died slowly and painfully as the infection progressed, but not before he pushed every piece of furniture in the room against the door. Strange enough on its own, but the flag he'd constructed out of his own garments frightened everyone. He scrawled help on it, as if he intended to draw someone's notice down below, despite the fact that the lock was on his side. He could have left whenever he wanted. The cop I spoke with indicated he was there when they kicked down the door. Still remembers the expression in the deceased man's eyes. He was staring at the door 2 days after his death, white-knuckled fists grasping a blanket that smelled sickly sweet from all the sickness. There were others, too. Many people have fallen, many of whom have done so for no apparent cause. It became so nasty that they bricked the roof door, but by the time I arrived, someone had cleared it all away with a sledgehammer. I still do not hang out up there, not after I went up and saw pallid fingers grabbing the ledge, like if someone was hanging from it and holding on for dear life. I'm sure a lot of people see stuff like that and believe someone needs their assistance. They hurry over and give a hand, but something about those dirty nails rang off alarms in my thoughts. The fingers appeared to be all wrong, so I removed my coat and used a broom handle to bring it closer to the ledge. Sure enough, those monstrous hands grabbed the coat and wrenched it from my grasp, sending it falling into the parking lot below. I've considered taking a closer look from time to time, but I have a fear of heights and couldn't bring myself to investigate any further. You'd think I'd go, yet here is my home. I own it just as much as it does me. People even refer to me as the caregiver today, as if they forgot I wasn't always present. Can you believe it? The police treat me the same. Any reports of a break-in, they call me on my phone to come take a look, as if I'm some sort of authority. The philosopher was the only other person who stayed as long as I did. I don't know his name. I just call him that because of the books he left behind. He moved here when the block was still a place to live, and he stayed for a few years after it closed. There are many notebooks in his flat, thousands of pages discussing child sacrifice to gods that dislike being named, as well as images of odd items frozen in ice and medical shots that appear to be fabricated. At first, I assumed he came to document the curse. He has dozens of books filled with bizarre things he's seen, such as birds with too many wings or milk that turned into clotted blood in the bottle. But after searching through everything he owned, I discovered letters to a wife who had died during childbirth. He kept her death certificate in the back of an old-looking box filled with letters he'd continued to write her long after the date. Another box, just a row over, had the letters she had written back. Awful things were scrawled on odd shreds of filth and blood for ink. He dated them personally and occasionally kept notes about how they arrived to him. Delivered by a cannibalized rat right in front of me. My dentist pulled it from a cavity in my mouth, written in the web of a spider with 13 legs. Anyway, in one of the letters, he reveals the real reason for his move to Andale. Says Andale was the key to assisting her, and he was weeks away from figuring out how to unlock the door. He promised to bring his wife back. He told her he knew how. I'm not sure where he went next or what happened to him, but his flat was locked when I found it, and probably would have remained that way if the key hadn't been in my inside pocket the first morning. Now I dwell in his former home. It's safe inside. He has scribbled stuff on the wall to keep everything in order. Symbols that I don't understand but can easily trace are what I use. I review them every few months, and thus far they've kept me safe and sane. Because you require protection in Andale. I'm not sure when the curse evolved from something banal to something extremely real and awful. It wasn't all terrible luck or poverty, not in the end, and certainly not now. You can't just walk around Andale, especially not at night. It is risky. For starters, it attracts a steady stream of the severely ill who are likely to attack on sight if you're lucky. They generally turn up dead in the halls in the morning, but sometimes I only find fragments of them. Strips of skin floating in the brackish water that fills the basement stairs, or bleeding fingernails buried in the ceiling plaster. The weirdest one was a single tooth in a light bulb, with red gum still attached to the root and the glass all around it intact. Many of them come here with business similar to the philosophers, rituals, bargains, things like that. It is not a good idea to interrupt them or give them any indication that you may be a problem. Every night I lock my door and wait for Andale to conclude her job, and in the morning I sweep the tower block floor by floor, cleaning up whatever remains of the weird travelers. The majority of the rites do not appear to be authentic. In reality, I believe that many people who come here just become victims of something or someone else. There are several reasons to avoid Andale at night, and most of its visitors seem naive. Most of what I see appears to have been stolen from a poor death metal CD. I once came upon a book titled Satanism and Witchcraft in the 21st Century. It's difficult to believe that the secret inner workings of the world can be discovered in something with an ISBN and 3,000 Amazon reviews. Of course, not all attempts to harness Andale's vitality are so obvious. I had one guy show up at my door and pay me $3,000 in cash only to show him the darkest spot of the building. I didn't understand what he meant at first. I thought he meant light and shadow. Sort of, he said when I explained it to him. Darkness can be a part of it, but I'm seeking for a corner, preferably a straight angle or more sharp. Ideally, more acute. Do you understand what the phrase means? He seemed haughty, and his last sentence confirmed it. A good-looking guy in his late 20s wearing a decent suit. He looked like a traditional banker. They also acted like one. Plenty of places like that, I responded. There are lots of quirky rooms in Andale. People are trying to make the most of their limited space. Yes, the walls do occasionally intersect at sharp angles, but I'm not sure what you mean by dark. There's a basement. It is inundated. I can't think of anywhere darker than that. He bit his lip and paused for a second or two, as if he was seriously considering it. Not a bad suggestion, but too complex to implement. And I don't just mean dark as in the lack of light. I mean dark, like under the bed. Dark like a single chip in a wall that leads to a hollow area between the bricks, and as a youngster you can't help but wonder what lives there. Somewhere that just doesn't seem to get as much of God's attention as everywhere else. I thought about it for a second. His words were ambiguous, but darn if I didn't get what he meant. A corner? I asked. Does it have to be an acute corner? He nodded. I said, I think I know the place, and he smiled like a creep. I took him to a flat on the 8th level. It was decrepit like everywhere else, yet there was still enough of its old furniture strewn around. You can open random drawers in there and still see the cutlery that individuals used. There is even an ancient analog television on an old stand. You may perch on what's left of the sofa and stare at the TV as if you knew the people who used to live there. Run your thumb over the toaster dials, the fridge handle, or the fading plastic of a light switch, and you'll feel an agonizing loss that comes out of nowhere. Look above and you'll notice that the light fixture has been pulled out of the ceiling, as if someone attempted to swing from it. It's not a big location, by the way. 3 rooms, a bedroom with a rumpled double bed, a living room/kitchen, and a tiny little spare room that seems to have been used for storage, or possibly a washing machine if you were single and childless. A slither of space, a triangle scooped out of whatever room remained after other more essential walls had been built. The sofa and television were all arranged such that whoever sat down could always keep an eye on the room and its contents. You can see they put a cot inside, which is still there, with blue bottle flies flying overhead. You can't see inside the cot unless you go in and pull the sheets out, which no one has done for decades. It's gloomy beneath those old blankets, a thick shade that discourages a closer look, as if there's something in there that no one needs to see, and it's been sitting there for a long time, eating what little light there is. Even with a window in the room, daylight does not truly filter down. "Perfect," the merchant exclaimed upon seeing it. He looked around the flat, one detail at a time, pausing for a moment and smiling as he noticed the damaged light fixture. And the sight of the crib, with the flies still hovering above faded Winnie the Pooh blankets, made his breath seize in his throat. "This is good," he said. "It's dark like under the bed. You've earned the money. I could have had a dozen men sweep this room, but they would not have comprehended the brief as well as you did." "Thank you," I said, even though it wasn't exactly how I felt. The man sat down quietly and began unpacking his leather backpack. There were no pentagrams to be found, though he did unload 7 strange-looking candles. He saw me glancing at them and smiled. "Homemade," he said. "I molded each one with my hands. I'm not a terrific artist, but the effort is what matters. It took ages to rend the wax. Of course, that was the easiest part. The difficult thing was getting the fat to manufacture it. Did you realize there might be a surprising amount of security around a hospital's medical waste department?" "I didn't," I said, as he removed some frail pieces of wood and a few small nails. He carefully began nailing the splinters of wood together in what appeared to be random forms. "Oh well," he moaned after a few quiet moments, his fingers nimbly holding the little hammer and tapping away. He'd already put together at least 6 of the bizarre tiny wooden polygons, and each one gave me a strange sensation. "Do you want to stay and watch?" he asked. "Definitely not," I responded. He finished tapping and smiled once more. "Oh, you're clever," he replied. "That is the proper response, by the way. And if I'm to honor it, I should advise you that now is the safest time to depart." I made my way to the exit just as he ignited the first candles, but not before taking one last look at the cot. I was astonished to find a hollow blackness that went beyond the doorway, like a curtain draped across it, yet with depth that pulled the eye. The businessman ignored it for a few seconds before looking up at me expectantly. "Can I ask what you want?" I said. "Everyone who comes here, I don't get the sense it ever works out for them." "I'm looking for a new kind of afterlife," he explained. "Do you need one?" "We all need one," he replied with a sardonic laugh, "but only those of us who are willing to take a few chances will get a better deal. Everyone else," he grimaced, "it's worth the effort. But look who I am talking to." He gazed into the darkness that surrounded the doorway. Shapes might be seen floating by. "You should leave now," he stated. I shut the door and rushed to my apartment, knowing the walls would keep me secure as the sun fell. When I arrived the next day, the man's bag remained where I had last seen it, placed against one arm of the sofa. The candles had burned down to the very end of their wicks, leaving a lingering odor that can still be detected after all these years. And of the man himself, a shadow has been burned into the wall in the chamber with the cot, which still has bluebottle flies hovering overhead. It's fuzzy and faded, but it roughly resembles a man on his knees, his head bowed to the floor in a pleading motion. I've seen it move periodically, turn its head and look at me, at which point my temples throb, my ears explode, and a blackness creeps in at the edges of my eyesight. I never really regarded that flat to be Disneyland, but now I avoid it like the plague. Still, things could be worse. Not every ritual is this simple, and I've had to directly intervene on occasion, which I despise. If people want to poke about in the universe's undercarriage, that is their choice. It's one thing if I have to clean up the remnants, but that's a one-time task. Sometimes it's not so clean. One man arrived and informed me that he would be my new resident or neighbor, and that we would get to know each other. A bumbling elderly man with an upper-class accent and the appearance of a down-and-out professor. He set up in the room next to mine, and no matter how little I said to him, he never received the message and continued to act like a wonderful friend. The few times I did initiate discussion, it was to inform him that the location he had picked did not offer much protection. He pointed to some strange small sores and said they were his protection. Over the next few weeks, I'd run into him from time to time, always on his hands and knees, scraping some damp corner or moldy heap of lumpy growths. He collected fungus, he told me on the first day, and I'd frequently see him wiping his samples into petri plates, to which he mumbled little remarks when he thought I wasn't looking. I don't believe he was sane, but he was probably not absolutely insane, because he lived long enough to have a sense of Andale and only came out during the day. Meanwhile, his flat grew to house an increasing number of chittering terrariums and pickle jars, their contents obscured by murky fluids. He grew odd mushrooms and molds all over the place, encouraged them to suck up the darkness of Andale and let them develop in the arid conditions he'd created. Toward the end, mushrooms sprang out of the walls in his living room. Plaster crumbled beneath microbial armies, leaving only concrete and rebar, and mold continued to grow and thrive. I peered in a few times and discovered him feeding meat to the frilly growths that sprang from the old furniture. During this time, the symbols on our shared wall would frequently become hot, and I found myself needing to replace them almost daily as he tinkered away on the other side. I asked him once or twice to tone it down. "This is important work," he snarled, a nasty undertone coming into his voice. "I'm not some ditzy crackhead attempting to summon Baphomet. I am not looking to get high. This is science. Progress. That is what I'm striving for. Yeah, your progress is attempting to eat its way into my apartment. Can you ask for it to stop?" He came to a halt and paused in mid-gesture, as if I had said something incredibly foolish, brilliant, or a combination of the two. He gazed at the rashes on his arms, which had already begun to grow their own weird fruit. When he finally spoke again, it was sneaky, like if he were a lecherous old guy proposing to a nurse. "This fungi," he explained, "they had samples of it at the university for 30 years. Could you imagine? They had no idea what they possessed until I found it and unleashed its potential. Now that I've located the source, I can achieve things no one else thought imaginable. My thesis is based on the fungus's ability to assimilate information that surpasses previous research. And you have a good idea, right? Asking it may be an option." He crawled away without saying anything further, and for the next 4 days he worked on the structure like a frenzied tiny honeybee in the spring. Poking and poking, he put trap after trap and thoroughly cleaned them of any rats or mice he captured. When I made my morning sweeps, I'd find him standing over Andale's latest victims, scraping what remained of them into transparent bags for his personal use. "Don't mind me," he muttered. "It's worthless to you, but these poor souls could help me achieve great things." This continued for another month. He no longer removed mold and mushrooms from ancient apartments. He got obsessed with meat, and toward the end, I can certainly declare that I had never smelled anything worse than the stinging, musty aroma that emanated from under his sealed door. It had become so terrible that I was considering calling the cops and having him removed when he mysteriously vanished from Andale's halls. He appeared one morning, annoyingly shooing me out of the way as he lowered jars into the flooded cellar, and then he vanished, leaving Andale's halls silent once more. But that didn't imply he'd moved out. In reality, quite the opposite is true. It took 2 days before I decided to just burst down his door. I kicked at it with a short, sharp strike, only to have my leg disappear through wood with the texture of sodden cardboard. I released my foot and attempted a different approach, gripping the handle and pulling so hard that it popped straight out of the rotten wooden frame. Free to move, the door swung open with an unsettling creak, and fetid, hot, moist air blew out of the chamber. Inside, I discovered that the man's specimens had gone wild. Terrariums had fractured, with their contents flowing out. Frogs the size of footballs scowled at me from beneath fuzzy fronds, and insects with human eyes darted away before the amphibians could catch them. In one corner, rats had constructed a hive out of old cardboard, with their backs covered in fungal growths that resembled human fingers and other appendages. In another corner, something that resembled a black rubber sheet slapped frantically at passing rats, and it took me a few seconds to figure out it was a slime mold. When it finally caught anything, it pulled the weird creature, screeching, into the dark corner, where it grew and tightened around its food like a fist. I stared at it, scared, until one by one black orbs emerged from within the weird mass, revealing eyes that stared back at me. It was a cacophony of god-awful dread, so intense that I couldn't hear the muffled sound of a human straining to communicate. It eventually reached my ears, and I used my torch to illuminate the far wall without having to step inside. I discovered the scientist half-grown in the wall. Algae and moss covered him from head to toe, rendering him unrecognizable, but I had to presume it couldn't be anyone else. Wide eyes gazed at me, terrified and in pain, as ugly little bugs chewed away at what was left of his shins, while odd tendrils explored his ears and head, never stopping. He continued to try to talk, but the algal growths kept pushing their way into his mouth one by one, until something snapped. His eyes widened even further. His squeals became frenzied, and his jaw slid further down his chest before hitting the floor with a sodden thump. "Have you finally made contact?" I asked. That's a terrible concept if I ever heard one. What would a mushroom say, even under the best of circumstances, let alone one that grew among the rubble of Andale? I can only assume you never told it to get off my wall, did you? No. You probably had your own reasons for doing all of this, and that took precedence. That made me wonder what he had asked for. As the thought crossed my mind, I took a quick look around to see if anything stood out to me. Something was developing on the sofa that appeared to be human-shaped. It could have been my imagination, but in the dark it appeared to turn towards me. Meanwhile, the scientist continued to quiver in misery, his eyes fixed on me and pleading for assistance. "I'll see what I can do," I replied before slamming the door. Something about the unusual jumble on the sofa had severely disturbed me. I put out the word and requested a rifle, but a few days later received a crossbow instead. A nervous-looking 16-year-old boy delivered it to my home. I was astonished he'd entered the building, but who knows who directed him to do so? I've developed a bizarre sort of respect among the locals, which comes in useful. This boy looked like he would have stamped on my head and robbed me blind any other day. But when he spoke to me, he treated me with more dignity than I ever felt I deserved. I thanked him, took the crossbow, practiced with it for an afternoon before using it to kill the scientist the next morning. After a few hits, one thumped against his forehead and silenced his whimpering groans. I didn't see anything on the sofa this time, at least nothing human-shaped, which I was grateful about. After that, it was only a matter of phoning the cops and starting a long chain of events that culminated in half a dozen guys in hazmat suits blasting the room with toxic chemicals. I was anxious for long that they'd find a corpse and ask questions, but by the time anyone entered the room, all that remained of the scientist was a smudge on the floor. I never figured out what he was looking for, but it is not uncommon for my morning sweep to reveal a body, or part of it, covered with fungal growths, and I've occasionally seen a strange person lowering themselves into the elevator shaft's floodwater. Of course, I could be making connections that don't exist. That water supports a diverse range of organisms. The entire level is flooded, and if something was down there, it would have complete control over a vast area. It's a bizarre world down below. I should know because I had a pretty negative experience with one guest. I'll refer to him as the fisherman because he came to Andale due to the flooded basement. If you know where to search, you can find a snapshot that has been circulating for quite some time. God knows who got it and how, but it shows the flooded stairs going to the basement, as well as a hand that appears out of proportion beneath the brackish surface. It is reaching up from the depths and resting peacefully on the third step below the water, its fingers stretched in perfect symmetry like a starfish. When I first encountered him, he was sitting comfortably with his feet over the edge of the flooded shaft, water up to his knees, with a rod and line set up beside him. It was pretty surprising to see him there with a small fly fishing hat. An overweight but healthy-looking man in his 40s, holding an egg mayo sandwich in one hand and a phone playing Candy Crush on the other. I yelled out to him as I approached since, in my experience, shocking someone in Andale, no matter how calm they appear, is terrible for your health. When I attracted his attention, he looked up and smiled warmly. "Hello," he waved his sandwich. "Are you the caretaker?" "Yes, I am," I replied. "And you are?" "Just a tourist," he said, smiling. "Would you care to join me?" The sun had just risen. "You weren't here when it was dark, right?" I inquired with suspicion. "Oh no, you just caught me. I was only here for 10 minutes before you arrived. I was told you were willing to help for a little charge." "What kind of assistance?" I asked. "Oh, just give me a nudge if any of the lines start moving," he replied, referring to a pole he'd placed beside the basement stairs. The door was propped open, and the rope stretched down into the darkness below, where water lapped gently just out of sight. Another line had been formed in an area of the lobby where the floor had been pulled away, showing a hole straight down into the basement. I can't keep track of them all at once, you know. I have bells ready, but hey, 2 heads are better than 1. "What exactly are you hoping to catch down there?" I asked. "Are you familiar with the primordial ocean?" he stated. "The abyssal oceans that God divided into light and darkness, all that. It is not an actual location, but it does connect to specific bodies of water, depending on the time and place. The last known manifestation was in a tumbler of aged whiskey beneath an abandoned tavern in Mexico City. Some unlucky guy knocked it over and didn't notice until the next day when half the bar was suddenly submerged. Quickly corrected, however, some of the things swimming in the water were strange, and they all came from the bottom of a glass little bigger than my wrist. Can you imagine what we could accomplish with this?" he remarked, gesturing at the water around his feet. "Do you suppose there could be fish alive down there?" I asked. "At least," he responded. "I'd be happy to pay for any trustworthy information, of course. Do you have any idea what's down there?" "Not really," I replied with a shrug, "but I guess it wants to be left alone." You might be right there," he responded, gazing at his other rods. "I didn't just put out any old lure, you know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a bizarre tuft of fur and ivory, bringing it up for me to look at. A tooth from a man who drowned at sea. A drone recovered it from a shipwreck on the Norwegian shore. The fur is actually red algae that was seen growing on his bones. I have enough of these as well as other items that may appeal to those on the other side. My research was extensive and expensive. Come on, have a seat. Just remain here until the sun begins to set for a flat price of 1,000. I just need to sit? I asked, and let me know if you hear or see anything. I moaned and sat next him, folding my legs rather than allowing them to dangle in the water below. Despite my reservations, we remained like way for several hours. He'd brought a lot of food, mostly handmade, and plenty of cold beer. We sat there and said very little, but we ate and drank a lot. It wasn't something I would ordinarily do, but I was paid to be there, and I didn't have somewhere else to go. Overall, it was a pretty lovely afternoon, until I fell asleep. I awoke with a dreadful gasp. My chest felt tight as if something had been sitting on it, and the awful laughter and scampering feet I heard going off into the darkness suggested that it wasn't just a feeling. Panic was setting in when my eyes raced to the open doors and realized that the moon had been out for hours. I struggled for my torch and turned it on to discover that there was no sign of the fisherman. All of his belongings had been left behind, and all that remained of him was his hat, which drifted on the river. Even as I looked, a smooth, gleaming figure twisted beneath the water and lifted it to the surface. I recoiled and crawled away from it as quickly as possible. This was horrible. I knew deep down that I had never been in as much danger as I was in that moment. The open doors that led outdoors were enticing, but right beside them were the steps that headed down, and I swear I heard someone approaching. I couldn't help but remember the fungus man I saw in the scientist's flat. Then again, that basement was massive, and who knows what was down there. I opted to take the stairs. My heart remained in my chest the entire time. I'd never been caught outside my room at night before, not even on my first night when I slept in the lobby with my coat drawn over me. You don't get lucky again, especially with Andale, so I knew I had to be careful. I needed to be silent. My sole hope was to remain unseen. I took to stealth, climbing each floor in complete silence and concealing in well-known locations at the least sound of footsteps, human or otherwise. Andale comes alive at night. Strange children's whispered mutterings emerge from air vents after dwelling there for God knows how long. Other times I saw apparitions, including one of a kid, whose sight made my stomach growl with an unquenchable need that hurt to think about. She looked at me with begging eyes as I backed away from her open door. I might have been tempted to assist her if not for the moon looking through her translucent picture. Despite this, I survived and made it to the 14th story. But it was only at the final obstacle, so close to safety, that I came upon something out of a nightmare. A woman stood outside of my apartment door, silent, pale, dirt-covered fingernails. All too frequently, I'd open my door to see muddy footprints on the floor left by a woman's bare feet. Now I knew who abandoned them each night. I couldn't see her face from where I was hiding, but something about her seemed very familiar. When she finally turned to face me, I remembered. I recognized her, even though the majority of her face was missing. It was the philosopher's wife. He seems to have succeeded. But I couldn't comprehend at what god-dreadful price, because the woman staring at me had evidently spent some time in the dead. Only the poor lighting and her long hair concealed how ill she was feeling. A lipless grin gazed back at me from under sunken cheekbones and hollow eye sockets. And yet I could tell she had been gorgeous in another life, which made the image much more heartbreaking. "My darling," she said. And something in her voice made it difficult for me to remain calm. I'm not sure why. I'd been in that location for almost a decade and witnessed living nightmares, but it was this walking corpse that tested me to the edge. The unavoidable sense of loss weighed on me, and I found myself taking steps towards her, despite the fact that my knees buckled. By the time I got to her, I was crawling till I could grab her grimy, chilly leg, and it was the last thing I remembered before waking up in my bed the next morning. Everything appeared normal, so banal that I could have shrugged it off as a horrible nightmare. However, there were footsteps leading from my bed to the door, and later I found the fisherman's belongings much as he had left them, though when I finally reeled in his lines, I discovered the lures had been replaced with bits and pieces of the man who had originally set them up. I flung it all in the river below and decided to forget him. Of course, I can't stop myself from checking my peephole at night. I had never done this before, but now I do. I see her every time. She seemed depressed. It hurts me to think about her out there. It should be terrifying, but it feels like someone has ripped out my stomach and heart and let all of my insides fall out the bottom. Each time I see her, I wonder what he did to bring her back. He just gives one hint. A final letter, I believe. It isn't like he dated them. In it, he claims he would give anything to be able to hold her again. Not only his life, but all he's ever experienced. Every sunset, every good dream, every nightmare, every victory, every loss. He'd do anything to preserve her, even every memory that defines him. Sometimes I wonder about him, assuming we'd be around the same age. I'd like to picture what it would have been like for the two of us to meet as young men. But whenever I try to remember what my life was like before I arrived to this place and woke up with that cloak put over me, I don't know. It's just hard. It's as if there is nothing there. It's as if something reached in and snatched all the years away. I guess it's one of those things I'd rather not think about.